Okay, so my name's Serena. I'm a sophomore at Horseman, which is a school in the Bronx. And
Hmm.
I have an emerging interest in gender, sexuality, women's studies. And I looked at your profile, and it looks like you investigate a lot about women in Afghanistan and their advocacy and their power over there. And that just seemed really, really interesting to me. So I just have a couple of questions about your work and your research. And yeah, I'd love to get the opportunity to learn more about what you do, what inspires you, your interests, etc.
Sure, yeah, that's fine. Thank you so much for reaching out.
Thank you so much. Okay, so I guess the first question I have was I know you're a researcher at University of Colorado Boulder, and you're talking a lot about women's movements in Afghanistan. So I guess I'll just start broad and say, how'd you get into this line of work? Where did you start, and how'd you know you wanted to do what you do right now?
Oh, yeah, great question. Yeah, so I went to graduate school at Pennsylvania State University, and when I was doing my master's research, I was part of a basically a group of faculty and graduate students that were working on a project that was funded through the Human Rights Commission in Colorado. Listen to me, in Pennsylvania. To look at like hate crime activity because that was really high at that time, and like sort of white supremacist groups, and the my focus in that project was on women's roles in those organizations. And what I ended up finding out is many of them were homeschooling as a kind of perceived resistance to the US government, sort of because they felt like government schools, as they call them, which are, public schools, had become too open-minded and multicultural and all of that. And so I found that part of the research really interesting, but I wanted to do something really different for my PhD, and so I just started searching the internet for basically women's groups that were more, I guess, on the progressive feminist side rather than retrogressive, in my opinion. And in reality, I think, um, to and that's how I found Afghanistan. And the Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan, which is the organization I studied for my dissertation research, they had a pretty decent web presence at that time, and the internet was still pretty new and very new it didn't really exist at that time in Pakistan or in Afghanistan, but they were living in and working in refugee camps in Pakistan. And then I got connected to their support network in the US. And some of those activists are still friends of mine today. And so I just started uh, finding out if that was a viable project. And I was really just kind of fascinated. I became really fascinated with Afghanistan. And this was all started like in August of 2001. So in September, things really changed, and October changed even more when the US invaded Afghanistan. And so I spent, basically, really, it was until 2003 that I was able to actually go to Pakistan and visit with RAWA. So I spent a lot of time just reading everything I could get my hands on about Afghanistan, and I just was so mesmerized and fascinated by the place. And also, I'd met several RAWA members when they came on different speaking tours in the U.S. and interviewed people that were part of their support network. So it took a while for them to, trust me enough to actually come to their sort of base of operations in Peshawar, Pakistan. So.
Got it.
So it's kind of a weird circuitous route, but that's how I got there.
No, that's really interesting, and I think it's interesting that you just started studying it before we actually increased our presence in Afghanistan. Did you see RAWA and its advocacy kind of change as we increased our presence, and like what did you see change?
Yeah, oh, that's a great question. So I would say in the beginning, they like RAWA had a lot of popular support. They had really connected to different feminist organizations in the US, and even some like what I would say famous feminists, like they've met Jane Fonda and like Sally Field and these like older now or that are quite older actresses, but were sort of middle aged at that time. And they had met senators and all kinds of stuff. In fact, when I first met with them, they were like, "Do you know Jane Fonda?" I'm like, no, I have no idea. But anyway, it was kind of funny. So yeah, so they had really, this, and they had this really strong international support network, not just in the US, like they had a big support network in France and Australia, Japan, other parts of the world. And so I was really kind of fascinated as a geographer of like about that whole support network, as much as I was really interested in their ground operations. And so what I saw them happen, like, I don't think they've changed over time, but the way that they were perceived by the US, because I think the US originally saw them as a potential ally, but they were very critical of the US bombing of Afghanistan in 2001 and the high civilian casualty, and just the way the US was sort of just kind of coming in more like a colonial power than a liberating power. And so their critiques of the government, of what the U.S. was doing, really sort of soured that relationship, and so they kind of stayed more of an independent organization. However, organizations have women that were like, basically raised by RAWA as orphans in their, because they ran orphanages or in their schools. Some of them are still members. Some of them have left the organization, but they've started other like feminist or women's rights organizations that have similar ideologies and that sort of thing. But then after I finished my dissertation in 2005, I realized like my way of knowing Afghanistan was really only through them, through their organization. And so I still think they're amazing and support them, but I wanted to get more of a kind of broader perspective and understand like what is the perspective from like Islamic feminists, feminists that are really, because RAW was a very secular organization, and I was sort of interested in like women that were using Islam as a way of articulating women's liberation and women's rights, because women's rights in Islam are actually much higher than they are in Afghanistan, culturally and in some ways legally and politically as well. And so, and also I was kind of interested in women's roles in some of the leftist groups that still exist in Afghanistan. So, and all of that connected also to, I wanted to get a better sense of what the U.S. was doing in Afghanistan. And a friend of mine really encouraged me, who was working as a development worker in the aid and development community in the capital city in Kabul. And she was like, you really need to study this because it's nuts. It's like, things aren't going well, but you don't hear about that in the news. And so I kind of did a combined project of trying to broaden my understanding of women's activism in Afghanistan, while also keeping a kind of a really close eye on what was happening with the international community there and their impact on women's lives in Afghanistan and men's lives too, actually. So it was more of a more broader gender project there too.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, and especially the rhetoric that's been perpetuated, especially from like Islam, is the fact that women often have lesser rights compared to Western cultures, when in reality that's just not the case. It's culture that's really perpetuated it in like laws and regulations. And I guess it kind of leads me to like the third question, which is why it was UN movements and I guess UN humanitarian aid and fighting for the rights of women aren't necessarily targeted. How do you see local organizations like RAWA in Afghanistan or grassroots organizations that are local to the area differing in their advocacy from maybe UN women or just like blanketed solutions?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. So thank you for asking it, because I would say it's like night and day. These big projects that are really well funded, like the UN or USAID or all those projects, I think they really miss out on the cultural subtleties that local organizations have a much better sense of. Also, I mean, as a geographer, I really push this idea that what works in one province isn't going to work in another. Right. So it's an incredibly diverse country. It's diverse in many ways, not just ethnically. It's diverse in like education levels and belief systems. I mean, certain areas are more conservative than others. Certain areas have have different kinds of trauma, even from the war. And so what's going to work in one community won't necessarily work in the others. And then you have areas where there's high literacy rates for both men and women. So the local non-governmental organizations and also, just the local women's organizations had such a better sense of what was needed within a particular community. And I mean, I honestly got frustrated with UN Women when I was interviewing them, because I even asked one time, I'm like, so why aren't you actually, I was observing them in meetings and I'm like, well, these women have all these ideas. Like, why are you implementing their ideas? And like, well, we don't think they're good ideas. And I was like, well, I couldn't say anything because as a researcher, I have to, remain objective in those interviews. But like in my head, I was like, but they know their culture way better. Like, to me, how can you be a gender specialist or understand gender if you don't understand the culture with when it, you know, gender is how we all understand our own genders and our gender relations really has so much to do with location and culture. And without a clear understanding of that, you're just, and there's no one way of being a feminist, right? And women's rights advocacy in Afghanistan is multifaceted. I mean, women don't always agree, you know, like they may agree ideologically, yes, we want women to have more rights, yes, we want women, we want to stop, you know, domestic violence, we want to, you know, increase education for women, but the methodology or the path to doing that is very different for an Islamic feminist, say, than a kind of westernized liberal feminist or someone who's more leftist kind of Marxist feminist, you know. And then there's all kinds of different ways of thinking about it in between, you know. And some women don't, you know, they just want to live their lives and want to be left alone too, you know. It's not always, I mean, and that's true in the US too. I mean, I would say, depending on political party or belief systems or whether you're religious or not, you can have a really very different feeling about feminism or women's rights as a woman, you know, as
Yeah.
and then of course men have their own ideas too, you know, which complicates it too.
No,
Yeah.
that's
So I am a big fan of local small scale projects. I think the big scale projects really just miss out on the ability to effectively to create change that's going to work for local communities.
no. I honestly, I think blanketed solutions are often probably the most ineffective. Um,
I agree.
I I I remember one time. So my parents are from India, and so my dad is Muslim, and so essentially a lot of the times, this is not really in the spectrum of gender, but I remember last year we had our International Food Festival, and so they were talking about having all these different cultures come in, and they kept it right during Eid, which is when like
Oh,
a large amount of fasting occurs. And so
yeah.
like having this festival is great, but not really taking into account like the different cultures that are like kind of happening during that time is a little bit, and I think the same thing kind of goes with small scale or large scale organizations too. You don't really take in the different aspects of culture, because while in like reality a lot of people are Muslim, you have like Sunnis and Shias too. You have like different
Right, right.
ethnic backgrounds, and so that I think that's really important. um Anyways, those
And
were
people understand Islam differently depending on their like if they've had access to Islamic education versus just
exactly.
understanding it more in a cultural way, you know. Like some Afghans we've interviewed thought that certain, you know, cultural project or practices, I'm sorry, were Islamic when they're actually forbidden. They're haram, you know, they're
Yeah.
forbidden in Islam. So yeah.
um no, I find that really, really interesting. I think those are most of my questions.